buy versus build and allocation of resources are fascinating topics. We've obviously seen efficiency in the for-profit world of mergers and acquisitions. Why don't we see more of that in the nonprofit world? It seems like if we care about efficacy, if we care about results, it's proven there instead of the distractions of multiple charismatic personalities raising money for little niche things. We have roll-ups and we have these mergers and acquisitions, streamline, gain efficiency, build efficacy, actually see real results.
Do you think that's actually a true proposition? I think there'd be an awful lot of people who'd question that.
I think you've already said part of the answer to this question. You have a situation in which an executive director can only maintain so many relationships. So if you roll that all up into one big organization, what you're going to find is that the total amount of fundraising is going to decrease because you don't anymore have executive directors. People like to talk to the executive director. So if you, let's say an executive director can handle 10 really deep relationships or 5 really deep relationships. So you got 20 executive directors out there, then they can handle 100 relationships. If you roll that all up into one organization, it doesn't have the fundraising capacity anymore.
So let me answer this, and I'll draw on both questions because I think it's a great question that has more promise than perhaps we realize, and what you say is exactly right. There are areas of the nonprofit world where it would not make any sense at all. And so either because from a funding standpoint, the nature of the funding support is inherently reliant on the personal relationship between an individual or not. So frankly, foundation funding and wealthy individual funding is a lot harder to roll up, right? If you had 5 organizations and each one has developed these deep personal relationships, you take those people out of the equation, it's harder for that funding to just be rolled up. There are also probably some areas on the programmatic side where localness matters more. So, community engagement and a lot of civil rights actions in certain communities. On the other hand, there are areas of the nonprofit world where the funding sources are less personal. So government, despite politics and the rest, tends to not be quite as reliant on personality. Small contributions from, sort of swath of Americans' corporate funding, these tend in general to be less reliant on personal relationships, can be rolled up. And there are certainly programmatic areas where there are enormous benefits to scale. There are asset-intensive areas of the nonprofit world where there's underutilization. So, in the human services and residential space, there are places like the charter school world where there's data that shows that certain schools actually do better, than others, where in fact getting the assets and in this case the asset wouldn't necessarily just have to be a building, but literally the charter license or the contract, right, into the more effective hands would make a big difference. So I think that one of the lackings is a better understanding of where it would actually create impact and where it wouldn't. In the areas where it would create impact, which is something we're actually focused on as a firm, there are still some barriers. One of the barriers, and perhaps the most profound, is that you can't buy out the other party, right? So nobody can, you don't have a financial incentive to outweigh the personal incentive. So you literally have situations where the executive director of, say, the acquiree is looking at being without a job. And so they're going to do everything they can, whether they're conscious of it or not, to prevent the board from voting yes, right? And then the second, which is, I think, a more surmountable obstacle, is that there's no matchmaking function. So you have all kinds of investment banks, a deal's always good, and they're looking to tell people about that. and there's no such thing in the nonprofit world, again, because they can't get a percent. In fact, the closest thing there is to sort of widespread matchmaking that works to prompt mergers are executive search firms. Because when an executive director is retiring, I've worked with a couple organizations where when they get a call that says, do you know anyone that would be a good executive director for this other organization, they say, let me learn a little bit more about this organization you're working with, and it's led to some mergers. So in any event, I think there are areas where it would make sense. There are some barriers, some of which are insurmountable, but again, this is a place where I think is another place where philanthropy's dollars, particularly in geographically focused organizations, can be highly leveraged, because if you can, for instance, create some of the funding and capacity to identify the right matches, play the role of matchmaker, and create some of the even modest incentives like consulting packages and things like that that allow the leadership of one organization to have some role and not be tossed out on the street, I think you can smooth the way a lot.
The Medallion Foundation's done some of that. You might want to talk to her about that. Next question, Tony.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to something that you said at the end of your conversation and touch on a lot of the conversations in the room. You were saying the organization should consider not spending the last dollar of the year on the program. And in my observation, it's tremendously difficult on the funding side to have a conversation with a funder about leaving margin in the grant. Right? Everybody wants to give money to have it spent. So have you had any success thinking about or talking with funders about capital formation in the nonprofit context? Because it seems to me that would solve, to some degree, some of these transition problems and capacity building problems if you could build capital capacity in the nonprofit itself before.
I mean, there are definitely foundations, and I believe a growing number of foundations that have that perspective and that worldview. And it's not a revolution; it's more of an evolution. But every year there are more foundations that take it seriously, new foundations, existing foundations. So I think that the pool of people or pool of organizations with whom that conversation is natural is growing. But then the second thing I guess I would just say is that no is a really powerful word, and that I think nonprofit leaders underestimate the power of saying that, and that and that there's a tremendous amount, in some sense, of self-censorship, that nonprofit leaders propose things that aren't in their self-interest because they believe it's what will differentiate or make their proposal more attractive, and that nonprofit leaders can simply say, this is what we need, or in fact, in the budget this year, you see we're going to be making a contribution to our reserves. We have a policy that we, keep a 5% margin to add to reserves each year, and that's just our policy. It's not changing. It's not to say that there won't be pushback, but I actually think nonprofits will succeed a lot more often than they think if they just say, and boards can help. Our board requires that, for our own view of fiscal prudence, these are the things we take. I can't change that. I'm sorry.
Two quick add-ons, Tony. One, we've actually talked about this many times when SVP talks about general operating support. What we really need is unrestricted funding. And what I think is true is that funders absolutely, the way they fund just handicaps nonprofits. Right? The analogy is they got to build a 100-piece puzzle, and funders give them 57 of the same piece, and the other 43 they never give it to them. So they can't build a damn organization. They got 2 of all these pieces, but none of all these pieces, right? So part of what our funding does is it makes it so you can fill in some of those pieces. What I think has got to happen on the other side of the equation, though, is what nonprofits, the stuff Lynn said, the nonprofits have got to get good at reporting and articulating their outcomes and their impact. And I'm not saying you can put a number on everything, right? But if you want the funder to make unrestricted funding, that's what's got to happen on the other side of it, right? What's got to go along with it is there is this broader education, and what is certainly a I don't know if the word's irony or whatever, but the people that should understand it the most are private sector business people, and you have to understand it the least, right? If you equate what foundations do to nonprofits, to an investor did that to a business, they would freak out. But for some reason, they cannot make that translation. Right? If somebody went to Intel and said, you can only spend the money on the blah blah chip, Intel would say, go to hell. Right? But the nonprofit doesn't do that. They self-censor themselves, and they take whatever money they can get. It's just this, how some of this stuff is built up over the decades, to me, is just kind of doesn't make sense.
No, I agree with that, and it's in some sense what you're talking about is the transition from what you described as what you were offering to a funder, from the activity to the organization and its subtotal goals. Yep. And that's not easy, by the way, and that's another place where the kind of capacity building that you all offer in the non-financial sense can help tremendously.